Hello everyone, this is Rob Blackburn again, coming to you with some more cool code, HTML5, jQuery, JavaScript type stuff that where we can play with. Just this morning, a friend of mine, Josh, of Data Inc., it's data-inc.com, great site if you haven't looked it up, sent me some questions. Him and I have been working on some projects together that involve Google Visualization API and jQuery being used together to make some really cool visualizations. So he had sent me over some questions. He's not a developer by trade, but he's been doing some really cool stuff that even most developers would find challenging to do. So he'd sent me over some questions to get some insights and get some help on. So his first question was, how do I make a list from unique values of a specific column in the Google data table and then display them as an unordered list in the HTML? The second question, how do I make a table where if I click on a row, it filters on that row? At the same time, it puts a jQuery button above it that if I click on the button, it will remove the filter. Very easy to do once you've learned a couple tricks, and there's a couple functions in both the jQuery API and the Google Visualization that make both of those features pretty straightforward and easy to do. So let's jump right in the code, and I'll be throwing some JS Fiddle links up that'll actually include this code as well, just so that way if you want to take a look at the code later, you can. So let's jump into the code right now. And here we are. So I've opened up WebStorm, the IDE that I like to use for this type of project, and I started a new project called Examples and just used the HTML5 boilerplate template just to set up a quick project with all the files that we need, the HTML, the JavaScript, the CSS, and all that good stuff, just for a quick setup. So here's the HTML, index HTML that comes with the the HTML5 boilerplate project. And what we will do is we'll go ahead and open this up in a web browser real quick, and you will see that it is a blank HTML page. So let's go ahead and throw some content on here so that we have something to work with. We're going to give it a title. We're going to give it a div. And we're going to call it chart div. And we'll get another div, and we'll call this one table div. And there we have it. We now have our HTML page set up with some basic content. We will refresh real quick, and you'll see our header comes up, but nothing else because we haven't actually added any chart or data for the Google visualization yet. To do that, we're going to go ahead and just grab from the Google documentation just their basic startup example, just because we just need some data, we just need something to work with. We're going to open up main.js just because that's the HTML5 boilerplate's standard starting point for a JavaScript file. Just drop it all in. Save that. We can go back to our page. And you can see refreshing it that we now have the chart shows up, just their basic standard chart. What we're also going to do at this point, just so that way we can have it, we're going to open up the Chrome DevTools, and we're also going to hit this little tool down here, and we are going to check off Disable Cache. And we're going to close that. Now, every time we have the console up, it won't cache the page, so we don't have to worry about clearing our cache every time we come back and refresh the page. As long as we have the console up, we're good to go. So we'll just leave that up now, and we'll go back to our code. So we're ready now to actually do something. So Josh's questions are related to the Google Visualization tables. So we need to populate a Google Visualization table real quick. One thing we'll need to do with the API is at the top here, where it's telling Google what packages to load, we need to also load in the table package. Once that's done, we can come down here, and we can now make a new variable table. And I'll just paste in the line of code there because it's quite lengthy, and you don't want to sit here and watch me write all that out. And so we're going to call the tables draw function. We're going to draw the data, and we are going to pass in no options for now. There we have it. So now let's head over here and refresh, and now we have a table on the page of the same data as is in the pie chart. All right, now we're ready to actually start working on Josh's questions. So the first question being, how do we get a list of unique values of a specific column of the Google data table and then display them as an unordered list in the HTML. So what we're going to do is I'll just put that unordered list right here at the top. I'm assuming he's probably got some sort of user interaction that's going to trigger the displaying of the user list, but just the actual interaction to actually display the list is actually quite easy. So to do that, we're going to need some sort of div ID to actually put our list into. I'm just going to say unordered list here, and we're going to give it an ID of list. Well, and that'll be there. So now we have a DOM element that we can write to. We're going to come back to our JavaScript code, and just right here, there's some pretty cool functions that we can use here. So to look those up, we're going to go over here to the Google Visualization API documentation and reference, and right down here, you'll see that there's a function on the data table itself saying get distinct values, which returns an array of objects. So we're going to use that on our data table. You have to pass it which column you want. So let's look. We've got column 0 and column 1. Column 0 looks much more interesting to get. So we're going to say the var of items, whatever is that. All right, so now we have an array of objects that are items. And so to get going, let's go ahead and just output a single list item that's just some generic list item, just so we can show that we are able to access the DOM and get to it. So it's the DOM object with ID list underscore UL that we created just a second ago. And we are going to just write its HTML. And we're just going to make a list item. And we're just going to throw X's in there. And there we go. We have our X's being displayed. So what we can now do is we're actually going to loop over our items. So I equals 0. Length is the item dot length. And we're going to loop until when just a standard loop. So now what we want to do is add an item for each a list item for each item we have in our array. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to just write some HTML here. We're going to have a string, and we're going to keep appending each time we loop a new list item to that string. And we'll just do the same XXX here. And we will now do that. Now we don't want to re-add or add a list item every time we loop, because every time you add a list item, it redraws the DOM, which is bad performance. So what we really want to do is make a string of all the internal HTML and just append it once. So that way we only have one rewrite to the HTML DOM. So that should do it. Let's go test this on our page. As you can see, it does work. So there we go. Now we have the list being generated, one item per item. And all we really now need to do is actually output our item. So we're going to say item I. There you go. We now have the unordered list being outputted right onto the screen. Again, you'd probably want to have this as a reaction to some user interaction, something a little more advanced than this. But this gives you an idea of, okay, how do you get the distinct values from a column? Then how do you output those onto the page, and how to use jQuery to write that out? There's a couple more efficient ways, I think, to do this as well. But this is a fairly basic way, fairly easy, quick way to get to it. So now we can move on to Josh's second question, which was, how do I make a table where if I click on a row, it filters on that row? At the same time, if it puts a jQuery button above it, that if I click on the button, it removes the filter. All right, so this is pretty cool and a pretty common feature. One might think that what you want to do here is actually insert the button at the time that you filter the rows, at the time the table is clicked. You really don't want to do that, because then you're going to have to remove the button and re-add the button each time, or you're going to have to do some checking to see if the button was already added and all this good stuff. And that can cause a lot of DOM rewrites, and you could potentially even run into a memory leak that way. What you really want to do is add the button at the beginning of the page rendering, leave it there, but just show and hide it. So what we're going to first do is just add a button, have it displayed just so we can show that it's there and physically add it to the DOM, and then we can start using and manipulating that button. What I'm going to first do is jump over to a page that I used a lot when I was first learning jQuery that I think is really handy that I'd like to show you, called the jQuery cheat sheet. Heck, I still use it every once in a while these days. So here you'll see that it's got all the jQuery functions and the selector attributes and all that good stuff. And you'll see right here there's some DOM inspection and insertion and outside. And there's one called before, which inserts something just before an item. So we can use that. And to use that, what we're going to do is we can select our table. What was it? Div table? Table div? Which one? Table div. And we can go before, and we can insert a button, and just, call it filter. Or, let's call it unfilter, since it's supposed to be removing the filters. All right, so let's jump back over, refresh our page, and you'll notice just before the table we have an unfilter button. But one of the problems we're going to run into is we don't really have a reference to our button. We could throw in an ID here and then use a jQuery select to get the button. But there's actually an easier way of doing that. What we can do here is actually use jQuery to create the DOM object, or the element, and we can actually insert that element here using the before. So we just made a variable reference to that object, and you can actually do this where it makes that DOM object. And that does the same exact thing. We can refresh to prove it. It's still there. But now we have a reference to our button, which means we can do something like b.hide. Easy enough. And we could actually even do this, where we actually chain the function calls together, save a little bit of code, does the same exact thing. Awesome, right? So now you can start seeing kind of the power of jQuery a little bit, and that you can do some pretty cool stuff. So what do we need to do next in our question use case? Well, we need to add something to the table that when a row is clicked, it shows this button. So let's start there. So we're going to come back to our documentation. We're going to look at the table documentation. We're going to scroll down, and there's event action. So you can see one of the events that will be fired is select, which is fired when the table itself is selected. We also have some great documentation here on how to actually add an event listener to the table. So we'll go ahead and just copy this code so we don't have to write it all out. And let's go ahead and do that. Now, one note is I'm making some pretty hideous code here as far as this all should be broken up into functions and architected a little more cleanly. But of course, we're just answering questions here, and I could always do that later. So here we are. We're going to be adding an event to the table. We don't want the sort event. We want the select event. And right here is the function that's going to get called. And we can get rid of what it actually has here because all we want to do is show our button. So let's come back to our page, scroll down, click, boom, showed. So that's pretty cool, right? Nice and easy. So now we've got it where it's actually showing, but it's not actually re-hiding the filter when the filter itself is clicked. That's easy enough. In fact, we can use the jQuery, and this is where it does get a little confusing when you're using two APIs, because we have the Google Visualization API doing the add listeners, where we're adding a listener to the table, which is going to show the button. But the button itself is using jQuery, and jQuery does events slightly differently. But nonetheless, what we can do here is just say when this is clicked, we're going to fire this function. And what are we going to do? We're going to hide our button. So let's test that out now. Shows, hides, shows, hides. All right, so our button is functioning, but of course we're not actually filtering the table yet. So that's what we need to do next, is actually do a little bit of filtering and unfiltering. So we want to filter when the table is clicked. We want to remove the filter when the button is clicked. The good part is we already have our events happening where we have a click event on the button where we can do the unfiltering, and we already have an event handler on the table where we can add the filters. Question is, how do we do filtering? To do that, there's going to be two methods that we're going to primarily use. One, to get the selected row number, and two, to apply that filter. So the first method we'll use is the get selection from the chart itself, which will pass back an array of objects, each object having a row attribute, which will only use the first one of those array objects. The second function we will use is the set rows. And you can see right here, you can actually just pass in a row index or row indexes. And so once we know what row is selected, we can filter by that row using this data view. And we'll get into what a data view is in here in a second, but let's first just get the row selection one step at a time here. So in the actual selection here, we're going to say var selection equals, and it's the table dot. There we go. So now we have an object that references what was selected. Let's go ahead and output that so we can actually see. Now we could, it's in the documentation, but it's always good to just kind of look at what we have. So I'm going to use the console and just log out what this object is. We're going to refresh. Scroll down. And you can see it's an object. And it's an object that contains, it's an array of objects, and the objects contain row. And that's it. So we can come back here and we can experiment and say, okay, we're always going to just want the first element in that array, whatever it is. And we're going to want the row. So let's experiment with that, make sure that that's actually working. Row 1, row 0, row 2. Perfect. It's working great. So now that we have the row selection, we now need to actually filter the original source data by that and redraw our table and chart. To do that, we're going to have to use something called a data view. It's right here in the documentation. And what it basically does is it duplicates the data table itself and creates a writable version. So the original data table, you don't want to be changing the data too much. Where the data view itself, you can just change it to your heart's content. So that's what it does. You can have your data table, you clone it almost using the data view, and that data view you can say which columns and rows you want to use and display and show. So let's just copy their example to create a view itself. We're just going to paste that in. So you can see what they're doing. They're making a new view object using a data view, passing in the data using a get filtered rows, which is a function you can use to pass in a series of objects and get what rows match that filter. We don't need that in our example because Josh just wanted to filter based off of specific row selection. So we know what the row index we want, but it's good to know, and you should definitely note that you can do this. You can pass in filters, get an array of row indexes that matches those filters, and filter on that instead. But here, we just want to filter on the selected row. And we need to make that an array. You can see what they're doing afterwards is they're creating a new table chart, which we don't need to do because we've already created ours. But we do need to redraw it. And we'll get rid of the options that they had in there since we don't have any options for ours. And so that's going to redraw the chart table. We also have a pie chart that we want to redraw as well, so we'll go ahead and do that. And there we have it. Let's give that a shot. Onions. Very nice. It did filter. Unfortunately, our unfilter isn't working, so we really can't keep going. So to unfilter is going to be even easier, because all we really need to do is reset our chart and table back to the way it was. So we can come here and say chart draw and just redraw it with the original data. And that's it. Let's give that a shot. Filters down to onions. Unfilter puts it back. Filters it to zucchini. Unfilter puts it back. We're in good shape. So there you have it. We answered both questions. Thank you, Joss, for sending those over. Like I said, that's not necessarily the cleanest code. There's definitely a lot of cleanup I would do in there, splitting those up into functions and just following some best practices, of course. But it gets the idea across and shows what you could do, and hopefully inspires you, gives you some ideas of the further power of jQuery and Google Visualization APIs, the documentation for Google Visualization APIs out there for expanding your knowledge. Like I said, the Try jQuery Code School course, excellent course. Definitely, if you want to go further with jQuery, that's a great way to get started. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.